Jerry, who's not here. I always want to thank Abraham, who, along with Jerry, who's not here this evening, heads up Bagel U, which has just offered a tantalizing and delicious amount of learning over the past few years. It's been just really exciting. So thank you, Abraham, for all of your vision and everything you do. So I am delighted to welcome Andrew Feiler, who is a fifth generation Georgian. Having grown up Jewish in Savannah, he has been shaped by the rich complexities of the American South. Andrew has been long active in civic life. He has helped create over a dozen community initiatives, serves on multiple not-for-profit boards, and is an active advisor to numerous elected officials and political candidates. His art is an extension of his civic values. Feiler's photographs have been featured in the Wall Street Journal, Smithsonian, Architect, Preservation Eye on Photography, The Forward, as well as on CBS This Morning and NPR. His work has been displayed in galleries and museums, including solo exhibitions at such venues as the National Civil Rights Museum, at the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, National Center for Civil and Human Rights in Atlanta, and International Civil Rights Center and Museum in Greensboro, North Carolina. His work is in a number of public and private collections, including that of Atlanta University Center and Emory University. And you can explore more of his work at andrewfeiler.com. I would like to say on a personal note that I am sponsoring this evening in honor and memory of both of our fathers of blessed memory who were closest of friends for decades. And how proud they would be, and hopefully are somewhere, to see you coming, Andrew, this evening, and to this shul. And I have to say, my mother, who is on this as well, I would not be here if not for your parents, Andrew, because they introduced my parents. And in fact, my mother remembers you as a little baby because you were the first baby she ever spent any significant amount of time with. So this is a very special evening for me to be bringing you to this synagogue. And I've been an admirer of your work and really just impressed with your photographs and knowledge. And I'm just delighted and thrilled that you're here this evening. So thank you so much, Andrew, for being here. Welcome.
Thank you. It's such great to be with y'all. And Diana, as Diana said, my dad and Diana's dad spoke every business day for 40 years. There's very few people on the planet that could make that statement. And they were the closest of friends of their entire lives. And so it's a real special day to be here. Some of you know Diana's dad passed away a few years ago. My dad just passed away a couple months ago. But they would both be very proud of this gathering tonight. So, and Diana, it's great to be with your congregation as well. So this has been an extraordinary run. This book came out, actually, officially this book came out April 1st. I had an early experience of what we now all call the supply chain crisis. The book was actually stuck in the port of LA. It's printed in China. So it actually didn't arrive until May 1st. But it was featured in this extraordinary double-page spread in the Weekend Wall Street Journal. It was featured in Smithsonian Magazine. Those are two enormous milestones for any photographer. And this book is now in its third printing. There is an exhibition of this work that is accompanying the book, which debuted last year here in Atlanta at the National Center for Civil and Human Rights. And it just opened in Charlotte at the Charlotte Museum of History, and it will be traveling to Columbus, Georgia, Memphis, Tennessee, Nashville, Tennessee, the brand new Museum of the Southern Jewish Experience in New Orleans. If you have plans to go to New Orleans, it's a beautiful museum. And then the Virginia Museum of Richmond, Virginia Museum of History and Culture in Richmond. And that takes me through 2024. And I'm just starting to book 2025, 26. So hopefully it will be coming to a museum near you. I am going to share my screen here. And there we go. So let me just start with a simple premise. The Rosenwald Schools program is one of the most transformative developments in the first half of the 20th century in America. It dramatically reshapes the United States. It dramatically reshapes the African American experience, and yet it remains hidden history, and its scope and sweep is largely unknown. This is a photograph of a photograph. This portrait of Julius Rosenwald hangs on the wall of the Noble Hill School in Bartow County, Georgia. That's about an hour northwest of Atlanta. Julius Rosenwald was born to Jewish immigrants who had fled religious persecution in Germany. He grows up in Springfield, Illinois, across the street from Abraham Lincoln's home. If you go to downtown Springfield today, there is a 4-square block Lincoln Home National Historical Site. And across the street from Abraham Lincoln, where they have preserved in these 4 blocks all the historic buildings, and across the street from Abraham Lincoln's home is Julius Rosenwald's childhood home. Peter Ascoli, who's the principal biographer of Julius Rosenwald, told me the story that when he was researching this biography, he went down to Springfield and he was meeting with the superintendent of the Park Service of the National Historical Site. And he said, "Do you happen to know where Julius Rosenwald's childhood home was?" And the superintendent says, "You're sitting in it." It turns out that the Julius Rosenwald's home is the offices of the superintendent of the Park Service. There was not a plaque out in front of that building at that time. Today there is a plaque, and that plaque was placed by the campaign to create a Julius Rosenwald and Rosenwald's Schools National Historical Park. And the vision for that park is a visitor center in Chicago, with then 3 or so Rosenwald schools in each of the 15 states that had Rosenwald schools, except Missouri, which only had 3 and only has 1 left. Legislation actually cleared Congress at the end of 2020, and requiring the Secretary of the Interior to do a feasibility study for this. I serve on the advisory council of the campaign, and when this happens, and it will happen, this will be the first component of the United States National Park System to honor a Jewish American. So Julius Rosenwald rises to become the president of Sears, Roebuck and Company. They didn't have a term CEO back then. And with innovations like Satisfaction Guaranteed or Your Money Back, he turned Sears into the world's largest retailer of its era. And he becomes one of the earliest and greatest philanthropists in American history. And his cause is what later becomes known as civil rights. And he is specifically motivated by his Judaism. He says, "I believe in America, but I do not see how America can go forward if part of her people are left behind." See, he sees America as a safe haven from anti-Semitism, and he sees that safe haven weakened by how America is treating its African-American citizens. This is a portrait of Booker T. Washington that hangs above the mantle in what is now the president's house at what is now Tuskegee University. Booker T. Washington is born into slavery in Virginia. He goes to Hampton College in Virginia. He becomes an educator, and he's the founding principal of the historically Black college, originally known as Tuskegee Institute. Now, this is a rare photograph of the 2 men together, printed on fabric and sewn into a quilt to commemorate the restoration of the Pine Grove School in Richland County, South Carolina. And at the rededication ceremony, former students and former teachers were invited to sign the quilt, and it hangs today in the restored schoolhouse. And in fact, on the cover of my book is a photograph of the classroom that has been restored inside the schoolhouse, and you can see in the back left-hand corner this quilt hanging. Now, these 2 men meet in May 18th, 1911. That's almost exactly 110 years ago. And you have to remember that in 1911, it is before the Great Migration, which doesn't begin until later that decade. And so 90% of African Americans live in the South. By the end of the Great Migration, roughly 1970, 56% of African Americans live in the South. It is one of the largest displacements of people in human history. But in 1911, 90% of African Americans live in the South, and public schools for African Americans are mostly shacks, with a fraction of the funding for the education provided for the education of white children. Many jurisdictions do not even have public schools for African Americans. So Booker T. Washington invites Julius Rosenwald to come on to the board of Tuskegee Institute. Julius Rosenwald later that year takes a train down to Tuskegee, is impressed, and agrees to join the board of Tuskegee. But the two men like each other. They develop this friendship and they keep talking. What can we do together? And in 1912, they create the program that becomes known as Rosenwald Schools. I'm going to talk to you in detail about how that program worked. But before I do this, I want to point out something really essential. The relationship between Julius Rosenwald and Booker T. Washington is one of the earliest collaborations between Blacks and Jews in the cause of civil rights. And there is a direct connection between their collaboration, their friendship, the work of Abraham Joshua Heschel, with his white beard flowing arm in arm on the front lines with Dr. King, and who famously says that when he marched with Dr. King, he felt like his feet were praying. And what happened in Georgia almost exactly a year ago, when John Ossoff and Raphael Warnock campaigned across this state together for 2 months in a runoff, developing not just a political alliance, but a close personal friendship. And Georgia sends its first Jew and its first African American to the United States Senate. That relationship between John Ossoff and Raphael Warnock stands on the shoulders of the relationship of Julius Rosenwald and Booker T. Washington. Now, I'm going to describe the structure of this program because there's genius in the structure. But first, let me just tell you, this is a photograph of students and teachers out in front of the Jefferson Jacobs School. That's in Jefferson County, Kentucky, Louisville. The Rosenwald School program begins by reaching out to the Black communities across the South, because they had to agree to be that Rosenwald and Washington wanted these communities to be full partners in their own progress. And they said, if you will contribute to a school, and we will count as your contribution, cash, land, material, or labor. And if you'll reach out to the school board, the white school board, because we want to be deliberate in creating Black-white dialogue as a foundation for future progress. And these have to be public schools. While we welcome the school system's contribution, at a minimum, they have to agree to own, maintain, and staff the school, pay for the teachers. You do those things, and Julius Rosenwald will make a substantial contribution towards school construction. Now, think about this. The Black community has to participate. This is one of the earliest examples of challenge grants. The white school system has to agree to participate. This is one of the earliest examples of public-private partnership. Now, I'm going to pause for a second and just talk about this photograph. The program begins with a pilot of 6 schools, all close to Tuskegee, where Booker T. Washington and his team can keep an eye on the program. And Booker T. Washington has these photographs made of students and teachers standing proudly in front of their schools, carrying the hopes and dreams of their communities, and he sends them to Julius Rosenwald, who writes back that he is so moved that he is committing to expand the program. These photographs continue to be taken throughout the entire history of the program, and they become part of the visual history of the program, the visual language of the program. All of my bodies of photography prior to this body were in color, but it is in honor of the role that these photographs play in the history of this program, that this entire body of work is shot in black and white and horizontal. So the white community has to contribute, and the first community to make the match is the Lochapoka community in Lee County, Alabama. This is their fundraising begins in 1912. From 1912 until 1937, when Franklin Roosevelt presides over the dedication of the Eleanor Roosevelt School, the last Rosenwald School, in 1937, this program builds 4,978 schools across 15 southern and border states, and the results are transformative. Before I do that, before I talk about the transformation, I'll talk a little bit about this school. Franklin Roosevelt, this is Meriwether County, Georgia, Warm Springs. Franklin Roosevelt, not yet president, in 1929, sees a Rosenwald school in Meriwether County and understands that the county needs more Rosenwald schools because of the density of the Black population. And he calls up the Rosenwald Fund and says, we need more Rosenwald schools in Meriwether County. It's 1929. The recession has set in. The school board is unable to contribute. The Black community is unable to contribute, and the idea languishes. So in 1937, President Roosevelt calls up Edwin Embry, who's running the Rosenwald Fund, and says, I'm ready for my school. Well, the program actually ended in 1932. So from 1912 to 1932, 20 years, they actually built 4,977 schools. President Roosevelt is calling up 5 years later, and Edwin Embry says, well, Mr. President, the program actually ended 5 years ago, but for you, Mr. President, we'll make an exception. The White School Board contributes, the Black community contributes, the Rosenwald Fund contributes, and the WPA contributes. And the head of the WPA comes to the Oval Office to report to President Roosevelt, and he reports that they are $1,000 short. And President Roosevelt, in the Oval Office, pulls out his checkbook and writes the check that closes the gap to fund the school. And later that year, he presides over the dedication ceremony. This school closed in 1972. It was sold to a family in the cabinet business, and you see they bricked up the windows to use it for storage. The moment that I'm taking this photograph, it was for sale. And I'm pleased to report that with the assistance of the Georgia Trust for Historic Preservation, the schoolhouse has been purchased. Preservation easements have been put on it, and it's been sold to a brother-sister team who are now raising the funds to restore the schoolhouse and turn it into a museum and community center. Now, I said the results of this program were transformative. There are two economists from the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago who have done 5 studies of Rosenwald schools. And what their data shows is that prior to World War I, there was a large and persistent Black-white education gap in the South. That gap closes precipitously between World War I and World War II, and the single greatest driver of that achievement, and it is an achievement, is Rosenwald schools. In addition, many of the leaders and foot soldiers of the civil rights movement to come through these schools. Medgar Evers, Maya Angelou, multiple members of the Little Rock Nine who integrate Little Rock Central High School, and Congressman John Lewis all went to Rosenwald schools. Now, as Diana mentioned, I grew up in Savannah, Georgia. I'll just throw in this tidbit. I grew up as a member of Mikveh Israel, which is the 3rd oldest Jewish congregation in America, founded in 1733. And in 1980, my mom became the first female president. And I left the South after high school and went bouncing around the world for 15 years. I never thought I would come back to the South, but I moved back to Atlanta 27 years ago. And for 25 years, for that entire time, I've lived in the 5th Congressional District. And for 25 years, I was a constituent of Congressman Lewis. So I reached out to Congressman Lewis and I asked if he would write the introduction to this book. And he said to me, I'm not sure I'm comfortable writing the history of Rosenwald schools. I just know I went to school there. So I explained to Congressman Lewis that I would have an essay in this book, and that there would be 2 essays by prominent African-American preservationists. But we had the history covered. And I said to Congressman Lewis, what I want you to do is what only you can do. Bring us into that classroom. What was it like to go to school there? What role did education play in your life? And he said, oh, I could do that. And so it was on October 29th of 2019. I found myself in Congressman Lewis's Washington office with sitting around this round table in the middle of his space, working with him on the introduction. And at the end of that, his jacket had been drooped behind his chair, and he put his jacket on so I could take his portrait. And he said, I have this, he has this, as you see, this cancer awareness ribbon on his lapel. And he said, should I take this ribbon off? And I said, Congressman Lewis, I want the authentic you. That is the authentic you, leave it on. And it was exactly 2 months later, on December 29th of 2019, that Congressman Lewis went public with the pancreatic cancer diagnosis that would eventually kill him later the next year. You know, I didn't start out to have this extraordinary experience, this one-on-one experience with Congressman Lewis, but what an incredible gift to come from this project. I'm going to show you some more portraits as we get into this work, but so let me just use this photograph for a moment just to talk a little bit about the structure of my portraiture. Congressman Lewis's office had said to me, can we do this portrait in his Atlanta office? And somewhat boldly, I said no, because to me, the setting is part of the photograph, of the portrait. And in this case, it was very important to do the portrait in Congressman Lewis's Washington office, because that was a statement of achievement and a statement of power. In addition, I never told anybody what to wear. I wanted them to be authentic. And I didn't tell them what expressions to put on their faces, because I wanted them to have agency in the role that they, in how they helped me tell this story. This is the Emory School in Hale County, Alabama, likely the oldest surviving Rosenwald school. The first couple of years of the program, there's not very good records about the dates, but this is one of the few surviving examples of one of the earliest design of Rosenwald schools. Now, I had never heard of Rosenwald schools until early 2015, when I found myself at lunch with a woman named Jeannie Syriac, who originated the role of African-American Cultural Heritage Specialist at the Georgia State Historic Preservation Office. And she's the first person to tell me about Rosenwald schools. And the story shocked me. I'm a fifth generation Jewish Georgian. I've been a progressive activist my entire life. How could I have never heard of Rosenwald schools? I mean, the pillars of this story, literally the pillars of my life. So I came home to this desk, I Googled Rosenwald schools, and I found that there were a number of largely academic books on the topic, but there was not a comprehensive photographic account of the program. And so I set out to do exactly that. And over 3.5 years, I drove 25,000 miles across all 15 of the program states. Of the original 4,978 schools, about 500 survive. Of those, only half are restored. And I shot 105 of the surviving schools. And the result is this book. So I'm going to bring you inside the Emory School, because I want to talk about the architectural language of this program. To do that, though, I have to tell you the story of Robert Robinson Taylor. Robert Robinson Taylor was the first African-American to attend MIT, the first accredited African-American architect. And for the political junkies here, he also happens to be the great-grandfather of Valerie Jarrett, long a fixture in Chicago public policy circles and a principal aide to President Obama during his entire tenure in the White House. He's also hired by Booker T. Washington to be the chief architect at Tuskegee. If you go to Tuskegee today, which in itself is a National Historical Site, many of the beautiful buildings on that campus were designed by Robert Robinson Taylor. And Robert Robinson Taylor leads the team of architects that lay out the architectural principles of Rosenwald schools. It starts on the left with these banks of large windows, these 9/9 pane windows to let in lots of light, because these schoolhouses originally would not have had electricity. On the right, cloakrooms so that dirty outer garments could be kept out of the education spaces, and the education spaces kept cleaner. Brick chimneys that vented the potbelly stoves that kept these schoolhouses warm on colder days. And toward the back of this space, you see this room divider. That room divider would have originally had a series of doors in it that could be closed off to separate these two education spaces, or accordioned back so that the unified space could be a community center outside of education hours. These basic architectural principles, this is progressive era architecture in service to education. These basic principles persist throughout the entire history of the program. Now, this is what's known as a one-teacher school. This is a two-teacher school, the Hope School in Newberry County, South Carolina. James Hope was the state school superintendent in South Carolina, a big advocate of Rosenwald schools. Every county in South Carolina had Rosenwald schools, and the Hope family all but donated. They actually sold for $5, which back in 1926 was, even then, was a donation. Donated the 2 acres of land for the school. And when the school closed in 1954, the community named it the Hope School in honor of James Hope's contribution. The schoolhouse closed in 54, it goes into disrepair, and the grandnephew of James Hope, a man named Ron Hope, was a career Army officer, retired back to Pomeria, South Carolina, and took it upon himself to truly single-handedly restore the schoolhouse. And if today, if you go to Washington, D.C., to the National Museum of African American History and Culture, you will find from this schoolhouse 6 school desks, 1 potbelly stove, and the original sign proclaiming Hope School. This is a 2-teacher school. This is a 3-teacher school, the Pleasant Plains School, Hartford County, North Carolina. Now, the design idiom of the Rosenwald schools is that they were to be modest. That was in part to avoid attracting the ire, otherwise known as arson, from the white citizenry. It was also to save cost. But more specifically, they had a rule that I sort of refer to as the no doodads rule. One of the architectural leaders of the program strongly disliked cupolas on schoolhouses because he believed a cupola was derivative of church architecture, and it should not be on a public building because that violated separation of church and state. But this schoolhouse has a cupola. Remember, the African American community has to contribute, and that contribution can include materials and labor. This community wanted a cupola on its schoolhouse, and it built a cupola. In fact, of the 105 schools I went to, 3 of them have cupolas. This is an expression, this cupola is an expression of African American community agency in 1920 Jim Crow, North Carolina. Now, notice that these schoolhouses, 1, 2, and 3 teacher schoolhouses, are all small white clapboard structures. Most of these schoolhouses were smaller, but by the end of the program, they're building 1, 2, and 3-story red brick buildings. This is the Dunbar School in Pulaski County, Arkansas, otherwise known as Little Rock. Several of the members of the Little Rock 9, who integrated Little Rock Central High, which is a mile away, went to this school prior to integrating Little Rock Central. And if the Art Deco detailing of the schoolhouse looks vaguely familiar, it's because the architect of the Dunbar School was also the architect of Little Rock Central. Now, I started this project. I knew this was an extraordinary story. It was not as clear. How do you tell this story visually? And so I started out shooting exterior images in this architectural narrative of the small white clapboard structures to larger brick structures. But I soon realized that that story was incomplete, because with half of the schoolhouses, not only 10% of the schoolhouses surviving and only half of those restored, there is an inherent plea for preservation in this story. But most of these schoolhouses were small. And so they had outgrown their use as for educational purposes long ago. In fact, of the 105 schools I went to, only 5 are still in use for educational purposes. So they had to have been adaptively reused to survive. And to tell the adaptive reuse narrative, I had to get inside. And to get inside, suddenly I needed permission. And that's when I meet all of these extraordinary people, former students, former teachers, preservationists, civic leaders, and I bring their stories into this work with portraits. These are the Pleasant Hill Quilters in Cass County, Texas. 3 of these women had parents who attended Rosenwald schools. 3 of these women attended Rosenwald schools, and LaJoyce Flanagan in the front row in the center was a teacher in this school, the Pleasant Hill School. After the school closed, it fell into great disrepair, and these women took it upon themselves to lead the effort to restore the schoolhouse. And they sold quilts to raise the money, and they have successfully now turned the Pleasant Hill School now into a community center, and the women gather in the schoolhouse on most Mondays to quilt. And I'll just add this little tidbit. We commissioned them to do a quilt, and our bedspread is a quilt from the Pleasant Hill Quilters. This is another example of a community center. This is the Lincoln School in Bledsoe County, Tennessee. Notice the walls and ceilings. The walls and ceilings of this schoolhouse are all covered with this exquisitely beautiful decorative pressed tin. I know of no other schoolhouse that has this. This is another example, an extraordinary example of African-American community agency and the pride that this community had in its schoolhouse. Some of these schoolhouses became churches or were adjoining churches. The churches often led the fundraising effort. This is the Denby School in Warwick County, Virginia. I'm going to tell you the story of this schoolhouse. The Beatrice Combs and her husband both attended this schoolhouse. And when the schoolhouse closed, they bought the schoolhouse and immediately got into a fight. He wanted to turn it into a bar. She said, over my dead body. It is a two-teacher school. They rented it out to two different families. And Beatrice Combs, to quote her daughter, accepted the Lord and got involved with a church that at the time was in a strip shopping center. And eventually they sold the schoolhouse to the church. The schoolhouse was the church. The school congregation thrived. They've added on this larger church, and this schoolhouse is now the Beatrice Combs Social Hall. And her portrait presides over that schoolhouse. She was a member of this church, an usher at this church, the secretary of the church her entire life. And when my exhibition was up at the Center for Civil and Human Rights here in Atlanta, her family came down for a tour of the exhibition, which was really a wonderful moment. So some of these have been turned into churches. This is the Warfield School, Montgomery County, Tennessee. That is where the schoolhouse has been restored into both a museum and community center, and this beautiful portrait of Abraham Lincoln on the wall. And you see the shadow of these iconic 9/9 pane windows that are the sort of architectural signature of the Rosenwald Schools program. But many of these schoolhouses remain in disrepair. This is the Hanah School in Newberry County, South Carolina, across the street from the Hanah AME Church, which is the namesake for the school. You see that the church's graveyard has grown up around the schoolhouse, and in the kind of detail that you just could never make up. The schoolhouse is on Deadfall Road. But you see this schoolhouse is in great disrepair and at risk of collapse. And these types of historic resources are the locus of history and memory and story in a community. And when we lose this type of historic resource, we lose a piece of our soul. And so there is in this project an inherent plea for preservation. And indeed, there were times when I was on this journey that I came across schoolhouses that had collapsed so recently. They were surrounded by yellow caution tape, emergency fencing, or in the case of the W.E.B. Du Bois School in Wake County, the school had been demolished a week before I got there because it had fallen into such disrepair it was deemed unstable. And you see this Coke machine standing sentinel in the midst of the rubble. But as I said, the sort of emotional heart of this journey was the extraordinary people that I met. These are brothers Frank and Charles Brinkley. The photograph of Julius Rosenwald that hangs above the doorway, this is the K. Rose School in Sumner County, Tennessee. That photograph has hung in that space since this schoolhouse opened in 1923. Frank and Charles Brinkley both attended this school. They both went to college. They both went to graduate school. They both became educators. Frank became a high school math and science teacher. Charles became a middle school principal. They have 4 sisters, all of whom attended this school, all of whom went to college. And these 6 siblings had 10 children. All 10 children went to college. That legacy may not have happened if it were not for this schoolhouse. This is the Bay Spring School in Forest County, Mississippi. To tell you the story of this school, I have to tell you the story of Vernon Damer Sr. Vernon Damer's grandfather donated the 2 acres of land for this schoolhouse. Vernon Damer had been a student in this school. When the schoolhouse closed in 1958, the grandfather had been smart enough to build in a reversionary clause, so the schoolhouse reverted to Vernon Damer, who turned it into a center of civil rights activism. SNCC met here, the NAACP met here. And when Vernon Damer, who was the head of the NAACP in Forest County, Mississippi, when Vernon Damer drove African Americans into Hattiesburg to help them attempt to register to vote, he would have them park behind the schoolhouse so they could not be identified by their vehicles and harassed. All of this activity, as you can imagine, drew the attention and ire of the KKK. And on the night of January 10th, 1966, Vernon Damer's home was firebombed by the KKK. Vernon Dahmer stood in the front window of his living room with a shotgun, holding off the attackers so that his wife Ellie could get their children out the back door. And Vernon Dahmer died as a result of his injuries in that fire. This is inside the Bay Springs School. This is Ellie Dahmer, the widow of Vernon Dahmer. Ellie attended a different Rosenwald school in Mississippi, went to college, came back and taught in this schoolhouse. And when it closed in 1958, because they had built a consolidated, larger, segregated school for African Americans. Note, this is 1958, 4 years after the first Supreme Court desegregation order, and the state of Mississippi is still building segregated schools. Ellie Dahmer was denied employment at that consolidated school because of her husband's activism, and she had to get a job at a school district 35 miles away, and she taught there for 21 years. Their son, Dennis, has now restored this schoolhouse back to its community center roots. And Dennis told me the story that when he was 11 years old, in 1964, Freedom Summer, and the Dahmer family threw on the grounds of this schoolhouse a picnic for the voter registration volunteers, black and white. And at age 11, it was the first time Dennis Dahmer had seen blacks and whites socialize together. This is the last schoolhouse I'm going to share with you today. This is the Hopewell School in Bastrop County, Texas. At the moment this photograph is taken, the schoolhouse was in the final stages of being turned into back into a community center and museum. This is inside. You see the mottled texture on the wall, that's primer. You see the plastic sheeting on the floor. The potbelly stove on the right is wrapped with protective plastic. The photograph in the center of this image is from the 19th century. That is Sophia and Martin McDonald. They were both born into slavery. Upon emancipation, Martin started raising farm animals. He acquired some land, acquired some more land. He eventually acquired 1,200 acres. And when the Rosenwald Schools program comes to Bastrop County, Texas in 1919, the family donates 2 acres of land for the school. Its first teacher is their daughter. And one of her students is her daughter, Sophia Williams, shown here on the right, holding up this beautiful portrait of her grandparents. Her husband, Elroy Williams, on the left, went to a different Rosenwald school in Bastrop County. They both, Elroy and Sophia, both went off to college, both returned to Bastrop County and had an entire career as educators, and now they're in the final stages of leading the restoration effort at this school. I found this time and time again, students becoming teachers, becoming the keepers of history and memory in a community. And I also found this, so many of these extraordinary stories that I have written a short story that goes with each photograph, or in some cases, pairs of photographs. Many bodies of photography stand only on the photographs, but this is a body of work that includes photographs and stories. I found Rosenwald Schools directly connected to the Trail of Tears, the Tuskegee syphilis study, the Tuskegee Airmen, the litigation of Brown v. Board, murder, embezzlement. And so I hope that you will, if you're interested in this book, I will put in the chat a link to the book's available on Amazon. You can also buy it signed and personalized copies through my website. I'll put the link in the chat when I stop sharing my screen. But I hope you'll spend time with these, not only the photographs, but read the stories, because I think you'll be inspired and I think you'll be moved by what it says about the possibility of change in America. Before I conclude, I want to there's one other related story that is so important. This is a book about the Rosenwald Schools. But there's another component of Julius Rosenwald's philanthropy that is so impactful that I had to find a way to include it in this work. And that is the program that was known as the Rosenwald Fellowships. From 1928 to 1948, the Rosenwald Fellowships gave grants to intellectuals and creatives 278 of those grants went to white Southern liberals, like newspaper editor Ralph McGill here in Atlanta, of the Atlanta Constitution, playwright Lillian Smith, but 587 of those grants went to African Americans, and it is one of the largest. It is the single largest source of grant philanthropic support of African American intellectuals and creatives in the 20th century. And it is a veritable who's who of 20th century African American intelligentsia. Elaine Locke, James Weldon Johnson, Langston Hughes, Marian Anderson, Zora Neale Hurston. And Gordon Parks was the first photographer to be awarded a Rosenwald grant. Gordon Parks, who was the first African American on the staff of Life magazine, first African American photographer on the staff of Life magazine. Gordon Parks was long one of the principal inspirations behind my work. It is really from Gordon Parks that I learned that art could be activism. And I had the great privilege of spending some time with Gordon Parks in 1993 when he was on book tour for his memoir, Voices in the Mirror. Now roll forward in Atlanta, Georgia, and my wife and I happened to be friendly with Leslie Parks Bailey, Gordon Parks's daughter. And so I had this idea that I wanted to use Gordon Parks' story to bring into this overall narrative the story of the Rosenwald Fellowships. And so I called up Leslie and I asked her, told her I had this idea of using her father's story to tell the Rosenwald Fellowship story, and then I wanted to have a photograph of her holding a photograph of her dad, and she thought it was a great idea, and she put me in touch with the Gordon Parks Foundation, and they immediately emailed back this photograph, and they said this self-portrait was part of his Rosenwald Fellowship application. Will this do? And of course, I was incredibly excited. And I want to add a little detail here. Gordon, some of you may know that Gordon Parks, there is this group of one of the great moments in 20th century documentary photography was the Farm Security Administration. This was a New Deal agency that was documenting the state of the poverty and crisis on American farms driven by the Depression, and how ultimately the New Deal agencies were helping with that. And it was led by a man named Roy Stryker, who assembled this incredible group of photographers that includes folks like Dorothea Lange and Walker Evans and Gordon Parks. It was the Rosenwald Fellowship that connected Gordon Parks to Roy Stryker, placed him in that group, and Roy Stryker says to Gordon Parks on the very first day, I want you to go downtown to Washington, D.C. to such and such a department store. Gordon Parks has come there from south side of Chicago, and I want you to buy an overcoat and then come back and see me. Gordon Parks goes downtown, he goes into the store, and of course, he's thrown out. And he's furious. And he goes back to Roy Stryker, and Roy Stryker says, photograph your anger. Some of you may know one of Gordon Parks's most famous photographs is of an African-American woman who's cleaning a government office building. And goes out that night and does this photograph of her with a mop in one hand and a broom in the other, standing in front of the American flag. He brings this photograph back. It's one of his most recognized photographs. He brings this photograph back to Roy Stryker, and Roy Stryker says, are you trying to get us fired? That photograph is not shown publicly for about 5 years. That's how sensitive that era was. So the last thing I'll tell you about this is that I also knew from the beginning that I wanted to do this photograph on top of a manhole cover, because one of Gordon Parks's seminal photo essays was a photo illustration he did for Life magazine in 1952 of Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, and the Invisible Man is coming out of a manhole, and has with this manhole propped above his head as he peers out of the manhole, and so that's a reference to Gordon Parks's work with Life magazine. So I just want to close with a little story and a little riff on the title of this work, and I'll tell you where the title comes from. As I mentioned, there are only 5 of the Rosenwald schools that I saw that are still in use for educational purposes. One of them is the Plaisance School in St. Landry Parish, Louisiana, which added on to in 1960 and is now an active elementary school. Well, it's actually very difficult. It happens to be a very difficult layout. I had been through there. I'd taken a photograph of the school. I didn't like it. I decided to go back, and for various reasons, I decided I needed to be there early in the morning, and it happened to be a weekday. So I'm going to be the strange guy out in front of the schoolhouse early in the morning, shooting the school. I better tell somebody I'm coming. So I called and introduced myself to the principal, said it was fine. And so I go take the picture. It actually still takes me a while. I'm waiting for the light, the clouds to be right. And so by the time I finish, school has started, and I go in and introduce myself to the principal. And it turns out this principal knew a lot about this schoolhouse. This is a schoolhouse where 70% of the money came from the African-American community. Julius Rosenwald put up here the 30%. There was no contribution from the white community or from the white school board. And she's marveling at this commitment, because remember, these are African-Americans who are already being taxed to pay for white schools. And she says to me, they worked and they strove and they did what they could to make a better life for their children, because in their eyes, education was liberation. And that conversation is the genesis of the title of this book. And I thought that I chose this for the title also because it fits all of the players in this story. Julius Rosenwald was looking for a better life for his children. Booker T. Washington was looking for a better life for his children. The African-American communities who had to dig deep to help make these schools possible, they were looking for better lives for their children. And I think that this story at a fundamental level speaks to everybody. Y'all are going to go march this week for Ukraine, for everybody marching in the streets today for a better world. This story is an important reminder that Julius Rosenwald and Booker T. Washington in Jim Crow America of 1912 are reaching across divides of race, religion, and region, and they fundamentally changed this country for the better. And it is a reminder to all of us that our individual actions matter. So I'll close on a quotation from Congressman Lewis's introduction to this book. He says, each of us has a moral obligation, a mission, and a mandate, that when we see something that is not right and not just, we must find a way to get in the way. And so I'll close this portion of our discussion with the refrain of Congressman Lewis's most fervent call: may we all find our paths to the making of good trouble. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Andrew. That was fantastic. And we are now open for everybody to come with any questions or observations or anything that you would like to say or ask right now.
I can't see the screen right. I am putting in the chat a link to where you can get the book on my website. And yes, I'm happy to take questions.
I actually have a question. First of all, Andrew, thank you so much. Shabbat Shalom. This was just fantastic.
Thank you.
How is the story, how is the history of the Rosenwald schools incorporated into current African-American history education for kids, particularly maybe at middle or high school levels? Do you know?
It's generally not. This is what I call hidden history.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, anytime you're teaching history, you have to make choices. And of course, we're having a cultural fight over those choices right now. But so there's the story is not well known, and it's predominantly not well known for one particular reason, and that is that Julius Rosenwald was one of the earliest philanthropists to mandate that the funds should be given away within X number of years of his death. Julius Rosenwald believed that the generation that helped create the wealth should benefit from the philanthropy associated with that wealth. So that his customers would be the generation that helped create his wealth, would be the generation that benefited from it. And so he mandated that all the funds would be given away within 25 years of his death. And in fact, they're given away within 15 years of his death. Julius Rosenwald dies in 1932, and the fund expends its and is shut down in 1948. And so one of the reasons Julius Rosenwald's story is, by the way, this has become very fashionable in philanthropy today, right? Bill Gates has said this, Warren Buffett has said this, here in Atlanta, Bernie Marcus has said this. But it is one of the reasons why Julius Rosenwald is less well known than some of his philanthropic peers like Carnegie and Ford and Rockefeller that have foundations that still bear their name. The other is that maybe the early generation knew about it there was Julius Rosenwald, but by the time these schools, these were multiple generations. This was a multiple generational initiative, right? You're building schools in 1912. Most of these, if you look in one of the things that I did with this book is that the titles of the images of the schoolhouses have a certain nomenclature to them. First, it's the name of the school, because these names are just so beautifully iconic. They're often named after the churches that were nearby, or leaders in the community, or features of the landscape, or famous people in African-American history. Lincoln, there's a number of schools named after Lincoln. There's a number of schools named after the poet Paul Dunbar. And so there's the name, then there's the county and the state, because the funds flowed through the counties, county school boards. And then there's the opening date and the closing date. And the reason the closing date is there is that the response to Brown v. Board, which is 1954 and 1955, there's two different, actually, we call it Brown v. Board, but it's actually two decisions over 2 different years, varies not just by state, but by school district. Many of these schools are open into the late 1960s, and some of them are open into the early 1970s as segregated schools. And so by the time you've got multiple generations that come through these schools, just like Congressman Lewis said to me, Congressman Lewis was the third generation of his family to go to a Rosenwald school. And he says to me, I just know I went to school there, right? That is what's common today. And so the story has been largely lost to history. Unfortunately, what my work is about using photographs to bring people into stories that they might not otherwise find accessible.
Anita.
I was just curious if there were any Rosenwald schools in Florida.
Yes, the schools were in all 11 states of the former Confederacy, plus Oklahoma, Missouri, Kentucky, and Maryland. There are very few surviving Rosenwald schools in Florida. I think maybe 10. And two of them are in the book.
And if I were to like Google them, would I be able to locate where some might be?
There's one in the so there's a strange answer to your question. I spent an enormous amount of time sitting at this desk Googling, trying to find Rosenwald schools. It's very hard to find. In some cases, it's easy to find them. Like the Maryland State Historic Preservation Office has a Excel spreadsheet with 54 surviving Rosenwald schools. There's a website where there's I think it's 26 surviving Rosenwald schools in South Carolina. I had GPS coordinates for them. In the state of Mississippi, I found a list of 13 surviving Rosenwald schools, but all it had was the county. And I could not find anything online. I finally had to find Rosenwald schools in Mississippi, I had to call the State Historic Preservation Office. Jeannie Syriac, who is the historian or the preservationist who first told me about Rosenwald schools, scoffed at all of this because she went around the state of Georgia. She was the first person to document surviving Rosenwald schools in the state of Georgia. She found 37 of them by showing up in communities and like going to the black side of town, because one of the things that I found in this journey is that segregated housing patterns still persist many years later. And basically saying, do you remember this school? And she found 37 of them, and she did a a group list. It's called a multi-site listing of the National Register of Historic Places. And she scoffed at my efforts because she did all of that before the internet. So she thought I had it easy. The reason I go into all that story now is there's a shocking amount of more information now on Rosenwald schools than there was when I was doing this research in sort of 2016, 2017, 2018 is when most of this work got done. So if you Google Rosenwald schools in Florida now, I'm not sure what you would find, but you would probably find more than I had found. I found maybe 5. I know that there's a few more. There's one on the campus of FAMU. There's one in my book that's the Peck School, beautiful building that's been restored and turned into a civic space on Amelia Island in Fernandina. There's one in Fort Myers. It's also in my book. And there's one that's it was at one point it was a public library. It's outside of north of Orlando. And I forgot, it's this little small town north of Orlando. And it was converted to a library, but now it's a daycare center.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation. It was terrific.
Thank you.
I see Jim and Lauren.
Yeah, my question was about whether any of those schools ever became integrated.
Yes, they did. But that was rare. There is an example of one of the, I mentioned that this when I was talking about preservation. There is a school in Suffolk County, which is now Suffolk County, Virginia. Back then it was actually at a different county, had a different name. That there was, this was one of the schoolhouses that I came across that had collapsed just before I got there, and there was this emergency fencing around it. But when that school, that school became an integrated school and served as an integrated school for up until about 1980, so maybe for 15 years or so. But generally what happened was the opposite, because what would happen was these are segregated schools, and they had Black teachers. And when the schools consolidated, the white community didn't want to send their children to schools that had been Black schools. So the Black children went to the white schools, and many of the Black teachers lost their jobs. So there's a double-edged sword to this piece of the history, that many Black teachers lost their jobs because of when integration came.
Right. Thank you.
Betsy.
Hi, that was a wonderful talk. I have a question. I think I might know the answer to this, or I think I might anticipate what you'll say, but I loved how you traced the relationship to Senators Ossoff and Warnock today, and I recognize that legacy. But I did wonder about even more immediate relationship building between the Jewish and Black communities. I wondered to what extent that was there, to what extent was there any Jewish involvement in the schools in an ongoing way, or I don't know, an ongoing awareness at the schools of the origins of the school? I'm just curious whether you feel like the schools did the work of any relationship building between the two communities, even while they were still operating historically.
Yeah. When the schools were built, there was certainly an awareness that the money was coming from Julius Rosenwald. And in fact, Dennis Damer told me this great story, because if you know that Sears really began as a catalog company, and they only later went into retail stores. And the catalogs in the South, and particularly in the Black community, were especially impactful, because it was a way for the African-American community to buy goods without suffering the indignities that they would suffer if they went to Main Street, right? Where they weren't allowed to try on clothes, they had to come through the back door, they had to wait behind white customers. And what Dennis told me was that the white merchants, in order to try to discourage people from using the Sears catalog, had started this rumor that Sears was Jewish and Roebuck was Black. So I think the early generation was more aware of it, but then, as I mentioned, over time, the Black community becomes less aware of the partnership, and frankly, the Jewish community becomes less aware of the partnership. Actually, I'll tell you a funny story. When this work, as you know, this work came out in the Wall Street Journal, but I had reached out to a friend of mine who happened to be an editor at the New York Times, who this is before the Wall Street Journal. Of course, you get one, you don't get both. So I was very happy to get the Wall Street Journal, but I'd reached out to the New York Times somewhat simultaneously. And this photo editor was really interested in running the story. And then her editor killed it because he said, everybody knows this story. Now, there was a documentary film made by Aviva Kempner that came out at the end of 2015, about 9 months after I started this project, and it's a good film. But I can tell you, having been out talking about this for like 6 years, 99.6% of the people I talk to have never heard of this program. And it's just so classically New York to believe, oh, I saw a film once and therefore everybody knows the story. But it's not well known. And now, to get to the heart of your question, though, Jews are a pillar of the Civil Rights Coalition. And of course, after the Civil Rights Movement ends, Black-Jewish relations become much more complex. And so, but what I would say about that today is that Blacks and Jews remain pillars of the progressive American coalition. Despite all of the consternation you hear about, which groups are going to continue to support a progressive American agenda, 90% of African Americans still vote Democratic, and the percentage of African Americans, percentage of Jews that vote Democratic, it's like 72%, and it's been 72% for like 50 years. I mean, it is stunningly persistent. And so I think we are progressive colleagues, and we have to continue, we have to do more to act like it.
I would love for you to tell the group about, just like in a quick nutshell, because I didn't mention in the bio, about your photography project with historically Black colleges, just as a way to broaden this.
Yeah, so I'll just take a step back to lead into that question. I've been a serious photographer most of my life, but in 2008, my family went away to celebrate my parents' 50th wedding anniversary. And we came back, and the next day, Mike Miller, who was in business with my dad, died. 13 days later, my brother was diagnosed with bone cancer, a life-threatening bone cancer. He is fine now. That was not a given at the time. I had joined this family real estate business 2002 because my dad was diagnosed with Parkinson's and was getting sicker. And then in 2009, the real estate world imploded, and I began this. My dad couldn't work anymore. Mike had passed away, and here I am on, standing in this rubble of the Great Recession. And I spent 3 years and 4 months doing real estate workouts. And collectively, those 4.5 years are the kinds of experiences that cause you to say, what do you want to do the rest of your life? And so I started down this path of taking my work more seriously and mercifully being taken more seriously. And I was doing a body of work on abandoned public school spaces in Georgia, because an abandoned public school in the South is a story of demographics, white flight, gentrification. When Morris Brown College here in Atlanta filed for bankruptcy. Morris Brown College is one of the 5 historically Black colleges co-located in a part of Atlanta known as Atlanta University Center. It is one of the rare historically Black colleges founded by African Americans, because most were founded by white Northern missionaries and philanthropists. And in 2012, Morris Brown College filed for bankruptcy. And I thought, okay, this is a really important story. It's got race. Everything in the South has to be viewed through the prism of race. It's got religion. It was founded on the auspices of the AME Church. It has class, because Morris Brown was a college that was specifically focused on educating working class African Americans. And so I did what I do as a civic person. I looked at who was on the board, and there was a man named Sonny Walker, who was vice chair of the board of Morris Brown. Well, I had served at that point on a board with Sonny Walker. It happens to be the board of WABE, which is public broadcasting here in Atlanta, a board that actually just stepped down 2 months ago from chairing that board. But in 2015, I was a board member, 2012, I was a board member with Sonny. Sonny Walker had been a foot soldier of the civil rights movement. He was a professor at the historically Black college in Pine Bluff, Arkansas. He trained the Little Rock Nine on nonviolence. And I reached out to Sonny and I said, okay, Sonny, I've got this crazy idea to do a photo documentary of this abandoned campus. And he called me back 20 minutes later and he said, Stan Pritchett is the college president. Here's his cell phone number. He's waiting for this phone call. And the reason I go into all of that is there are other photographers that could have shot this work. But there was 20 years of social capital here in Atlanta at that point that allowed Dr. Walker and Dr. Pritchett to trust me to tell this very sensitive story. And the essence of the story is the importance of the past, present, and future of historically Black colleges, how there were originally 120 historically Black colleges. We're down to about 100. Those 100 colleges are 3% of colleges in America. They are more than 10% of African Americans who go to college and more than 25% of African Americans who earn degrees, which replants the story in the midst of this core societal question we have today. How do we create opportunity in America? How do we create an on-ramp to the middle class? But I rooted it also in a broader narrative that this education has been the backbone of the American dream for all Americans. Since before there was the United States of America, and in that story, in the stories that go with that body of work, I tell this narrative. The first taxpayer-funded public school in America dates to 1644 in Dedham, Massachusetts, and there's this long thread: public school, public commitment to public education, the Land Grant College Act, which is in 1872, historically Black colleges, Rosenwald schools, the GI education provisions, the GI Bill, Brown v. Board of Education, and so. What I do with that work is, and that book became it's called Without Regard to Sex, Race, or Color, which is a phrase that's on the school bell, dedicated to the education of youth, without regard to sex, race, or color. That uses these abandoned spaces, which feel very familiar to us, right? We've been in these classrooms, we've walked these hallways, we've been in these locker rooms, but we're used to seeing them populated by people and not by goats. And in that dissonance is the story of that work. And I'll just add, we're just off this extraordinary moment in my life. There's an African-American composer here in Atlanta named Doug Hooker. Doug and I have been friends for 25 years. And Doug was inspired by this book, Without Regard to Sex, Race, or Color, and he wrote what's known as a symphonic suite, which is a first movement of a symphony about the role of historically Black colleges. And we had the premiere of that symphonic suite when my photographs from this first book were up at the National Civil Rights Museum in Memphis. Well, then it was in Memphis for that I pulled out my laptop and showed Doug the beginnings of this Rosenwald work. He then wrote a second movement, which is about the Rosenwald schools, and then a third movement about the future of African Americans. The entire symphony takes its name from my first book, Without Regard to Sex, Race, or Color. And the world premiere of that symphony was February 6th here in Atlanta. And we're hoping that it will travel.
Mazel tov.
Yeah.
Amazing.
It was quite the night. And Diana, you will appreciate this. I asked my mom to come up for it. And she said, she kind of didn't want to travel. I'm like, come on. I was a little more diplomatic. I said, like, what else are you going to do? So she comes up, she flies up, told her I'd pick her up, Dad would take her back to the airport. Anyway, she comes to the event. The first thing she says when we get in the car after the symphony was, I'm so glad I came.
That's beautiful. So any last questions for Andrew this evening? There's my mom waving. Oh, mom, you're muted.
This is about the most interesting program I've ever attended in my life. Thank you very much, Andrew.
Tony, I'm assuming that what you really meant is the most interesting program you've attended at a synagogue. So great to see you. I'm so glad you were able
Thank
to
you.
be here. And Marla, great to see you too.
So happy. Thank you.
Andrew, thank you so much. This was extraordinary. And I'm so thrilled that all of you were here this evening. Good Shabbos. And it was just wonderful to share this evening with you. Again, thank you, Abri, Abraham, Andrew, everyone for being here tonight. Shabbat shalom. And we'll see you
Shabbat
next
shalom.
Shalom.
Thank
Thank you.
Thank
you.
Take care.
Hello, everyone.
That's great.
Hi, Nita. There am I.
No, we're not even on a camera. That was